On the bone-cold morning of January 15, 1947, in the quiet residential streets of Leimert Park, a neighborhood in the southern sprawl of Los Angeles, California, a housewife named Betty Bersinger was doing nothing more dangerous than taking a morning walk with her 3-year-old daughter along Norton Avenue, past the modest bungalows and the winter-dry lawns and the vacant lots that dotted the block, when something lying in the grass at the edge of one of those empty lots made her stop dead in her tracks, because at first glance it looked like a department store mannequin had been tossed out with the trash, pale, white, impossibly still, almost theatrical in its arrangement. But the longer Betty Bersinger stared, the more her brain refused to accept the explanation her eyes were trying to give her, and when she finally stepped close enough to see the truth, the scream that tore out of her throat echoed off every house on that street. Because what was lying in that vacant lot was not a mannequin at all, but the nude, completely drained, surgically bisected body of a young woman, a human being, a daughter, a dreamer, a 22-year-old girl from Boston, Massachusetts, named Elizabeth Ann Short, who had come to Los Angeles 7 months earlier, believing, the way so many young Americans have always believed, the way the country itself has always promised, that if you were willing to work hard enough and dream big enough, the City of Angels would eventually open its golden doors and let you in. And instead, those doors had led her straight into the hands of a monster. And what made the scene on Norton Avenue so uniquely, bone-chillingly horrifying, even by the already brutal standards of post-war American crime, was not just the violence of what had been done to Elizabeth Short's body, but the terrifying deliberateness of it, the almost incomprehensible level of control and calculation that the killer had exercised, because her body had been cut clean in two at the waist with surgical precision, the kind of precision that doesn't come from rage or frenzy, but from knowledge, medical knowledge, anatomical knowledge, the kind of knowledge that you only acquire through years of formal training. And the two halves of her body had been placed several inches apart in the grass, positioned and arranged as if the killer wanted her to be found exactly this way, displayed like an exhibit, like a message, like a twisted piece of art. And there was not a single drop of blood anywhere at the scene, not on the grass, not on the dirt nearby, which told investigators immediately and with absolute certainty that this was not where Elizabeth Short had been murdered. This was where she had been deposited. That somewhere out there in the sprawling city of Los Angeles was a building or a house or a room where the real horror had taken place, where she had been held captive, bound by her wrists and ankles. The rope marks were clearly visible during the autopsy, tortured over a period of what investigators believed was several days, subjected to horrific violence, including deep lacerations cut in the corners of her mouth that extended toward her ears in what would later be described as a Glasgow smile. All of this inflicted while she was still alive, and then finally killed by blunt force trauma to the head and face, the official cause of death listed as cerebral hemorrhage and shock. And after she was dead, her killer had drained her body completely of blood, every last drop, had washed her skin clean, had shampooed her dark hair until it gleamed, had cleaned underneath her fingernails, had removed and repositioned certain internal organs with the methodical tidiness of someone who had done something like this before, and then had transported her body across the city in the darkness and laid her out in that vacant lot on Norton Avenue like she was nothing, like she was an object to be discarded. And it was Betty Bersinger who found her at around 10 o'clock in the morning, and Betty Bersinger who ran to the nearest house and called the police, and Betty Bersinger who spent the rest of her life carrying the weight of what she had seen, a weight that never got lighter because it never got an answer, because the person who did this was never caught, never charged, never brought to justice, and would go on to live the remainder of their life in freedom while Elizabeth Short lay in a grave in Oakland, California.
And now let me tell you who Elizabeth Short actually was. Not the tabloid character, not the lurid nickname, not the mythology, because the press of 1947 did something truly vicious to this young woman in the weeks and months after her death. They invented a version of her that was easier to sell newspapers with, a femme fatale, a seductress, a reckless party girl who had brought danger upon herself by living on the wild fringes of Hollywood glamour, and almost none of it was true, because the real Elizabeth Short
was born on July 29, 1924, in Hyde Park, a neighborhood of Boston, Massachusetts, the third of 5 daughters born to Cleo and Phoebe Short. And her childhood was defined not by glamour, but by hardship. Because when Elizabeth was just 6 years old, her father, Cleo, vanished entirely, abandoned the family during the brutal economic pressure of the Great Depression, left his car near a bridge with implications of suicide, and let his wife and 5 daughters believe for years that he was dead. And Elizabeth grew up in that shadow, in a household held together by her mother's determination, in a modest Massachusetts town where the winters were long and opportunities were limited. And as a teenager, she developed serious respiratory problems that required her to spend winters somewhere warmer. And so each year she would travel south to Florida, working odd jobs, meeting people, building a version of herself that was slightly more interesting than the small-town girl she was trying to outgrow. And by all accounts of people who actually knew her, Elizabeth Short was not the woman the newspapers invented. She was gentle, she was sociable, she was charming in the way that naturally beautiful people sometimes are without even trying. But she was also reportedly quite shy about physical intimacy, quite reluctant to allow the many men who wanted to date her to get genuinely close. And this is a detail that matters enormously, because after her death, the press portrayed her as a woman who had slept her way through Hollywood, and it simply wasn't true. And in fact, when investigators tracked down the dozens of men whose names were in her address book, virtually every single one of them told the same story. They had met her at a bar or a restaurant or a party, had taken her to dinner, had been charmed by her, had tried to pursue something physical, and she had declined, warmly but clearly, and they had never seen her again. And one of the great cruelties of this case is that the woman the public came to obsess over was a fiction constructed by tabloid journalists, while the real Elizabeth Short, the quiet, slightly lost, endlessly hopeful young woman from Boston, was buried underneath it. And in January 1943, Elizabeth had traveled to California for the first time to reunite with her father, Cleo, who had turned out to be very much alive and was working as a civilian employee at Camp Cook, a military base in Santa Barbara County. And the reunion was cold and disappointing. Cleo showed little warmth toward the daughter who had spent years believing him dead, and Elizabeth left after a short stay and drifted to Santa Barbara, where she was arrested for underage drinking in the fall of that year and sent back to Massachusetts by police. And that arrest, that minor youthful indiscretion, meant that her fingerprints were now on file with both local authorities and the FBI, a fact that would become critically important years later when investigators needed to identify the body on Norton Avenue. And between 1943 and 1946, Elizabeth moved around the country, Massachusetts, Florida, Indiana, California again, always in motion, always looking for the version of her life that felt like it fit. And she had fallen in love during this period with a military officer named Major Matthew Gordon, Jr., and they had apparently become engaged. And then, in August 1945, just as the war was ending and the whole world was exhaling with relief, Matthew Gordon was killed in a plane crash in India. And Elizabeth Short lost the man she had planned to build her future with, and she never fully recovered from that loss. And some people who knew her in the years that followed said she seemed to be carrying something heavy, something she kept mostly to herself.
and by the summer of 1946, she had made her way back to Los Angeles, to Hollywood, to the city that the movies had spent decades telling the whole world was the place where second chances were born. And she found a rented room near the Florentine Gardens nightclub on Hollywood Boulevard, and she waitressed and she auditioned and she smiled at people, and she lied sometimes about jobs she hadn't had and credentials she didn't have, not out of malice, but out of the same desperate optimism that drives everyone who shows up in a big city with not enough money and too much hope. And then January 1947 arrived, and with it the end of everything. Because the last confirmed sighting of Elizabeth Short alive was on January 9, 1947, when a married traveling salesman named Robert Manley, called Red Manley for his hair, drove her from San Diego to Los Angeles. And Manley would later tell police, under extensive questioning, that he had spent 2 nights with Elizabeth in San Diego in the days before, and that she had been friendly and talkative, but had firmly resisted any physical intimacy, and that on January 9th he drove her to the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles because she said she was meeting her sister there, and he watched her walk through the lobby doors, and that was the last time anyone who has ever come forward can confirm they saw Elizabeth Short alive. Because witnesses at the Biltmore confirmed seeing a young woman matching her description, making phone calls from the payphones near the bar that evening. And then, nothing. Silence. A void. 6 days of absolute mystery, during which Elizabeth Short disappeared entirely from the record of human observation. 6 days in which she was somewhere in Los Angeles with someone, and nobody who knows what happened during those 6 days has ever come forward. And those 6 missing days are the black hole at the center of this entire case, the absence that makes everything else impossible, because whoever Elizabeth Short was with between January 9th and January 15th, 1947, was either the person who killed her or someone who knows who did. And when Betty Bersinger found her body on the morning of the 15th, and the police were called and the identification process began, the LAPD sent her fingerprints to the FBI in Washington, D.C., and because Elizabeth's prints were already in the federal system from her 1943 arrest, the identification came back quickly, and within hours, investigators knew they were looking at Elizabeth Ann Short, age 22, Boston, Massachusetts. And they also knew, from the very first moments of examining the scene and the body, that they were dealing with someone extraordinarily dangerous and extraordinarily careful. And they put out a bulletin, and they began knocking on doors, and the press got wind of the story before the day was out, and by the end of the week it had gone national, and by the end of the month it was international news. And the tabloids of 1947, which operated with none of
The ethical constraints we might hope for today descended on the story like a pack of wolves descending on an open wound. And the chaos that followed was not just a media frenzy, it was an active obstruction of justice, because reporters showed up at the crime scene so fast and in such numbers that they were walking all over potential evidence before detectives had properly processed it. Members of the public were picking up items from around the scene as ghoulish souvenirs, and in one of the most outrageous details of the entire case, reporters actually positioned themselves inside the LAPD station and were answering the tip phones, phones that were ringing in with potentially crucial information from members of the public, taking down the information and then withholding it from investigators to protect their newspaper scoops. And it was during this same chaotic period that the press gave Elizabeth Short the name that would follow her forever, the Black Dahlia, a nickname borrowed from the 1946 film noir The Blue Dahlia, starring Veronica Lake and Alan Ladd, and influenced by Elizabeth's dark-dyed hair and her rumored preference for black clothing. And the name was catchy and evocative and perfectly calibrated for a newspaper headline, and it stuck within days.
And with the name came the mythology, the invented biography, the fabricated promiscuity, the narrative that turned a lost and hopeful young woman into a symbol of dangerous feminine recklessness. And the real Elizabeth Short vanished underneath all of it. And then, on January 24th, 9 days after the body was discovered, postal inspectors intercepted a package addressed to the Los Angeles Examiner newspaper. And inside that package were Elizabeth Short's birth certificate, her Social Security card, her address book containing the names and contact information of 75 men she had known, and various other personal items, along with a note assembled from letters cut out of newspapers and magazines that read, "Here is Dahlia's belongings, letter to follow." And every single item in that package had been carefully wiped clean, some investigators believed with gasoline, to eliminate any fingerprints. And the implications of that package were staggering, because the killer had kept Elizabeth's personal belongings, had held on to them deliberately, and had then chosen to mail them to a newspaper rather than to the police, as if taunting not law enforcement but the public itself, as if performing for an audience. And more letters followed over the coming weeks, some addressed to police departments and some to newspapers, all assembled from cut newspaper clippings. And one letter received by the Herald Express read simply, "I will give up on Dahlia killing if I get 10 years. Don't try to find me." And whether these letters were genuinely from the killer or from one of the dozens of attention seekers and disturbed individuals who attached themselves to the case could never be definitively established. And the false confessions began almost immediately. The first came just 13 days after the body was found, from an Army veteran named Daniel Voorhees, who claimed to be the killer and then quickly recanted. And he would be followed by more than 60 other individuals who came forward over the subsequent months and years to confess to the murder of Elizabeth Short, each confession requiring investigation, each investigation consuming police resources that could never be recovered. And the LAPD was simultaneously chasing down every name in the address book, conducting polygraph tests, running background checks across the country with the assistance of the FBI, looking into medical professionals and surgical students at the University of Southern California Medical School, because the bisection of the body was so precise that investigators were convinced almost from day one that the killer had some form of anatomical training. And lead investigator Captain Jack Donahue told the press publicly that he believed Elizabeth had been murdered in a remote building or shack somewhere on the outskirts of Los Angeles, and her body transported to Norton Avenue afterward. And the LAPD investigated over 150 suspects in total, and the vast majority were cleared. And the case ground forward with enormous effort and very little result until it began, slowly, to lose momentum. And the first major suspect to attract serious attention was Robert "Red" Manley himself, the last man confirmed to have seen her alive. And he was arrested and interrogated at length and submitted to multiple polygraph examinations, and was ultimately cleared when no physical evidence connecting him to the crime could be found, and his account of dropping her at the Biltmore was corroborated. But the damage to his life was done, because being publicly named as the prime suspect in the most sensational murder case in California history destroyed him, and he suffered a mental breakdown in the early 1950s and spent years in and out of psychiatric care, an innocent man shattered by a case that was never his to answer for. And another suspect that attracted serious investigative attention was a drifter and former bellhop named Leslie Dillon, who came to police attention in late 1948 when an acquaintance contacted an LAPD psychiatrist named Dr. Joseph Paul DeRiver and claimed that Dillon had displayed specific knowledge of the Black Dahlia murder that went beyond what had been reported in the press. And Dillon was brought in for questioning and proved to be evasive and disturbing and knowledgeable in ways that alarmed investigators. But the case collapsed when legal missteps during his detention compromised the admissibility of evidence, and he was released. And the trail went cold again. And then there's Dr. George Hodel. And if you've been patient enough to follow this story this far, then what I'm about to tell you is the part that will stay with you. Because George Hodel was a physician, an intellectual, a man of considerable social standing in Los Angeles in the 1940s, brilliant and charming and deeply pathologically predatory. A man who had been investigated in connection with the death of his own secretary, Ruth Spaulding, before the Dahlia case ever began, and who had been accused and acquitted in a trial that many observers found troubling of sexually abusing his own daughter, Tamar. And George Hodel moved in the highest circles of Los Angeles society. He knew artists and politicians and celebrities, and he had trained as a surgeon, and he had the anatomical knowledge that the bisection of Elizabeth Short's body required. And he was never arrested in connection with her murder during his lifetime. But here is what makes this case truly extraordinary. In 2003, researchers discovered a file in the vault of the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office labeled George Hodel, Black Dahlia File. And inside that file was evidence that investigators had wiretapped George Hodel's home in 1950 while investigating him for other crimes. And among the recordings captured during that surveillance was a conversation between George Hodel and an unidentified visitor, during which George Hodel could be heard saying, and I want you to hear these words clearly, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead."
Those words became public. They sent a shockwave through the true crime community and through law enforcement circles that still hasn't fully settled. And then came something even more stunning, because George Hodel's own son, Steve Hodel, was a retired LAPD homicide detective, a man who had spent his career solving murders. And after his father's death, Steve Hodel spent years investigating him, poring over evidence, consulting with forensic experts, building a case the way only a trained homicide detective knows how to build a case. And he published his findings in a book called Black Dahlia Avenger, in which he concluded with what he described as near certainty that his father, George Hodel, had not only murdered Elizabeth Short, but had committed several other unsolved murders in Los Angeles, and was potentially connected to the Zodiac killings that would terrorize Northern California in the late 1960s. And LAPD Lieutenant Frank Jemison, who had worked the original investigation, reportedly told colleagues, "We know who the Black Dahlia killer was. He was a doctor, but we didn't have enough to put him away." And a deputy district attorney named Steve Kay, who conducted a formal review of the available evidence against George Hodel, stated his personal legal opinion that the case had been solved. And yet, George Hodel had fled the United States after the investigation closed in 1950, had spent 4 decades living in the Philippines, had returned to the United States only in his final years, and had died in 1999 at the age of 91, having never been charged with anything connected to the death of Elizabeth Short, having never stood in a courtroom, having never looked the Short family in the eye and answered for what the evidence suggests he did. And so, the murder of Elizabeth Ann Short remains, as of this day, an officially open and officially unsolved homicide. And we are left not with justice, but with a probability, a dark, heavy, infuriating probability. And we are left with Elizabeth herself, with the real Elizabeth, the one who was not the Black Dahlia, but a girl from Hyde Park, Boston, who grew up without a father, who lost her fiancé to a wartime crash, who moved to Hollywood because she was 21 and she believed that something better was waiting for her out there in the California sun. And she was right that something was waiting, just not the something she had imagined. And the lesson of this case, if there is one, is not just about the failure of law enforcement and the destruction wrought by tabloid journalism. It is about the way we treat the stories of the dead, the way we let sensationalism replace humanity, the way we reduce a person to a nickname and a headline, and forget that underneath the mythology there was a real human being with a real name and a real life that was taken from her before she ever got to finish it. And her name was Elizabeth Short, not the Black Dahlia, Elizabeth Short,
and she was 22 years old, and she had dark hair and a quiet smile, and she dreamed the same dreams that millions of Americans dream, and someone killed her and got away with it completely. And we owe her, at the very least, the dignity of remembering her as she actually was, a person, not a symbol. And if you are watching this right now, and you feel the weight of that injustice, then good, because that weight is the only honest response to a story this dark, this real, and this unfinished.